The org chart is a decision hypothesis. On added co-CEOs, SoftwareOne removed them. Here's why I think both choices are worth looking at. Lately, I've been thinking quite a bit about where I want to take decision velocity next. Frankly, the way I've been talking about it has started to feel forced. The frame also feels narrower than the questions I actually want to explore. One thing I do know is that I don't want to keep explaining authority, ownership, and decision closure as abstract ideas. They're useful, but they come alive when there's a real choice in front of us and enough evidence to think it through together. That's what I was looking for when two Swiss company announcements recently caught my attention. Why Swiss companies? No particular reason. They just happen to be. On Holding moved toward co-CEOs. SoftwareOne moved away from them. That contrast was enough to make me look more closely. At first, it sounds like another invitation to debate whether two CEOs are better than one. I'm not very interested in that debate. What kept me looking was the reason each company gave for choosing its structure. The closer I looked, the more the two announcements seemed to belong together. So why these two companies? If you don't know On, it's the Swiss performance sportswear company behind the Cloud running shoes. It was founded in 2010 and has grown into a global footwear, apparel, and accessories business. Its 2025 sales surpassed 3 billion Swiss francs, and it now operates in more than 90 countries. SoftwareOne, on the other hand, is a very different business. It helps organizations buy, manage, optimize, and modernize their software and cloud technology. In July of 2025, it combined with the Norwegian company Crayon. The enlarged company had about 13,000 people across more than 70 countries. So no, I'm not putting them together because running shoes and cloud software have much in common. I'm putting them together because both are Swiss-headquartered global companies dealing with a new level of complexity. Both recently used co-CEOs. Both talked about leadership structure as an answer to the phase the company was entering, and within less than 4 months, one moved toward shared executive leadership while the other moved away from it. That's a useful comparison. We get to see the same visible tool used for two very different jobs. On moved toward co-CEOs while SoftwareOne moved away from them. The contrast matters because the same leadership structure was being asked to do two different jobs. So, what caught me at On? In March 2026, On announced that co-founders David Almond and Kaspar Kapetti would become co-CEOs. They'd also remain executive co-chairman of the board. Scott McGuire would become president and COO with responsibility across the full value chain from research and manufacturing through marketing, commercial operations, and technology. The titles are interesting, but the wording behind them is what caught my attention. On said it wanted to connect founder-led strategic intent with execution, preserve entrepreneurial speed, and align founder stewardship directly with the work of running the company. 1 year earlier, On had moved from co-CEOs to Martin Hoffman as sole CEO. Now it was changing again, this time bringing two founders into the co-CEO roles and placing a president and COO across the operating core. You could look at that sequence and say On hasn't decided what structure it wants. I don't think the public record gives us enough to say that. What I see instead is a company moving judgment around as it needs change. The 2026 design seems to bring founder judgment closer to the top operating role while giving one executive a broad view across the value chain. That's an important tension in many founder-led companies. How do you keep the judgment that made the company distinctive without making every important operating decision travel back through the founders? The announcement tells us what On wants the structure to accomplish. It doesn't tell us how the authority works when the choices get difficult. Imagine a product launch where brand ambition, manufacturing readiness, margin, and market commitment all collide. Which parts belong to the co-CEOs? Which part belongs to the president and COO? When does asking for input turn into asking for approval? If the three roles see the trade-off differently, who can close the call? I don't know how ON has answered those questions internally, and it may be that they have answered them very well. My point is that those answers, not the titles, will determine whether the structure gives the company the agility it says it wants. SoftwareOne made the opposite move. SoftwareOne had a different problem to solve. When it combined with Crayon in July of 2025, Raphael Erb and Melissa Mulholland became co-CEOs of the enlarged company. Erb looked after commercial operations, services, and the marketplace. Mulholland handled strategy development, customer platforms, and global functions, among other areas. You can see why that might be useful during an integration. Two global businesses were bringing together leadership teams, operating models, customer relationships, brands, systems, legal entities, and regional organizations. Shared leadership could keep knowledge and continuity from both sides in the room while the new company was being assembled. Then, in July of 2026, SoftwareOne said the integration was substantially complete and named Erb sole CEO for the next phase. This is the part I keep coming back to. SoftwareOne's co-CEO structure had a stated job. It was there to support continuity through an integration. When the company believed the job was nearing completion, it changed the structure. In other words, the design had something close to an expiry condition. I can't tell you from the outside how well the co-CEO model worked. I can't tell you whether moving to one CEO will improve execution. I also can't see how the knowledge and relationships held across two roles will transfer into one. What I can say is that the public explanation makes the logic visible. The structure wasn't presented as a permanent belief about leadership. It was an answer to a particular phase. I think more companies would benefit from being that explicit. Here's the idea I can't shake. I've started to think of a leadership structure as a hypothesis about where judgment needs to sit right now. ON's apparent hypothesis is that founder judgment and an integrated operating core need to sit close together as the company scales. SoftwareOne's integration hypothesis was that shared executive leadership would help two global organizations become one. Its next hypothesis is that a sole CEO will better serve focus and execution in the phase that follows. Neither choice tells us that centralized authority is better than distributed authority. That's too simple. I've been using another phrase in my own thinking: the smallest complete authority. I don't mean the lowest person on the org chart or the fewest people in the room. I mean the smallest person or group that holds enough authority to make the whole trade-off and let the decision move. Sometimes that's one person. Sometimes it really does require two people with different judgment. Sometimes it belongs to an operator working inside a clear boundary. The trouble starts when responsibility sits in one place, but enough authority to make the trade-offs sit somewhere else. Then the decision has to travel again. It gets translated, softened, checked, reopened, or quietly routed back upward. That's where the org chart stops being a picture and becomes a decision system. 4 questions I'd want to ask. If you and I were inside either company, I wouldn't start by asking whether the structure looked modern or unconventional. I'd want to talk through 4 things. What is the job structure here to do? Not just why do we have 2 CEOs? What important kind of decision becomes easier to make because leadership has been designed this way? At ON, the public answer seems to involve connecting founder intent, product brand, and global execution. At SoftwareOne, the co-CEO answer was integration and continuity. The sole CEO answer is focus and execution in the next phase. If you can't say the job plainly, the structure may be carrying history rather than a current operating purpose. Which decisions are actually shared? Shared leadership doesn't mean every decision should be shared. There will be cases where 2 forms of judgment genuinely belong together. There'll be others where one person needs to make the final call. If nobody makes that distinction, ordinary work can turn into a negotiation among titles. Who owns the collision? This is where the chart meets the real work. A product ambition runs into manufacturing capacity. A customer platform choice changes a commercial commitment. Each leader can be perfectly clear about their own area while nobody owns the trade-off between them. Sometimes the most important authority rule isn't who owns each box, it's who owns the collision between them. What would make us change the structure again? SoftwareOne connected its co-CEO design to an integration mandate. That made the later change understandable. Other structures stay in place long after the reason for them has faded. People keep routing decisions through a design built for an earlier phase, then make up for the gaps through private conversations, repeated approval, and informal workarounds. You don't need an expiry date stamped on the org chart, but you do need some idea of what would trigger a review. It might be the end of an integration, a change in scale, a new strategy, a different role for the founder, or the same decisions repeatedly getting stuck between the same people. Why this sits inside decision velocity? Decision velocity started with a fairly simple observation. A decision can sound settled in a meeting and still fail to become usable in the work. The same thing can happen with organizational structure. Giving someone a CEO, COO, or president title doesn't finish the decisions about authority underneath the role. People still have to know whose judgment matters, who can make the trade-off, what can move without another round of approval, and what genuinely sends the decision back. When those boundaries are incomplete, a decision can leave the meeting looking clear and weaken when it crosses from one role to the other. That's what I've called a short decision half-life. This case lets me explore that idea without starting from a diagnosis or assuming anything is broken. We can begin with a real choice, look carefully at what the companies have told us, think about the design underneath it, and stay honest about what we can't see. That's much closer to the work I want to do. Bring it closer to home. If you and I were looking at a smaller founder-led company, I wouldn't begin by redrawing the whole org chart. I'd pick one decision that keeps crossing the founder-operator boundary. Maybe it's a large customer exception, a new offer, a market entry, hiring ahead of revenue, delaying a product until it meets the founder's standard. Then I'd ask, which part of this judgment really does need the founder? Which part can the operator own without another round of approval? Who makes the final call when brand, capacity, cash, and customer commitments collide? What threshold legitimately sends the decision back to the founder? What repeated evidence would tell us that the authority design needs to change? That's a more useful conversation than telling a founder to let go or an operator to take more ownership. It respects the judgment each person brings while making the boundary between them usable. What I don't know whether ON's new structure will work the way the company intends. I don't know whether SoftwareOne got what it needed from the co-CEO period, or whether one CEO will make the next phase easier. The public announcements can't answer those questions. I don't want these case files to pretend that they can. What I do take from the comparison is this. There isn't one fast org chart. There's only a structure that's more or less complete for the decisions, trade-offs, and company phase it has to carry. That's what caught my attention. The two companies made opposite choices, but both choices started to make more sense when I stopped asking which chart was right and asked what decision problem the chart was meant to solve. That's also the kind of inquiry I want to pursue through these case files. Start with something real, look beneath the obvious debate, separate fact from interpretation, then bring back a question that helps you see your own organization more clearly. Sources and evidence boundary. I've listed the primary sources that I used for this article. The company descriptions, scale, titles, dates, responsibilities, transaction details, and stated rationales come from those sources. The comparison, the decision hypothesis idea, smallest complete authority, and the decision velocity interpretation are my own. What I can't see from the public record is just as important. Informal authority, working relationships, actual decision paths, motives, conflicts, and whether either structure is working as intended. Before you go, this is the first of 3 decision system case files I'm developing over 6 weeks. If you'd like the next one, be sure to subscribe. And does this case file feel like I'm heading in the right direction? I'd love to hear your feedback. Drop a comment, like and share if you're interested in more of this.